Welcome back to The Broken Brain, everyone out there, as you know, of course. I hope, well, maybe it's your first time. Maybe you don't know. I'm Dwight. I'm the host. Either whether you know it or not, that's who I am. Grateful to have everybody tuning in. I'm really grateful for my guest today. I have Dr. Akeem Sule is on the program today. He is just a basically all-around cool guy. That's the first thing I'm going to say about you. I'm going to let you give your real credentials, but
stop it, Dwight. You're too kind.
just from our communications so far, we had we were able to do a call to talk about the show before, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, depends. People are busy, but it was that you took time to chat with me about this and set this up. But Dr. Sule is a very experienced psychiatrist and also expert in really just all things psychological intersection with culture. He's done a lot of work with music and hip hop as that relates to it. And now you're branching into other things, and we're excited to talk about some of the things you see in culture. But tell everybody about yourself and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Okay. I'm great to be here, Dwight. Really excited. Nice to meet a kindred spirit. And I just have to say one thing, Dwight can talk. So I just said I had to be on this podcast. Well,
we were saying who's going to out-talk the other one.
Absolutely. But just to say, so I'm a locum consultant psychiatrist. I work for the Essex Partnership University Trust. I am from Nigeria, and I'm also the co-founder of Hip Hop Psych. So you might have checked that out. But like Dwight said, I'm going more into like movies and TV shows. I've always had an interest in movies and TV shows. Basically, what I'm doing is analyzing these TV shows and films for psychological themes related to psychiatry or social determinants of health, looking at it from the lens of intersectionality, racism, and just basically having fun with it. But the main aim is to educate the public about these sorts of things. I'm also an honorary visiting research associate with the Cambridge University Department of Psychiatry and a Wolfson College research associate. Yeah, and love hip hop, love TV shows and movies, and I could just go on and on to the break of dawn. But let's just stop there with the introduction. The other thing is, yes, I'm also a member of the Black Psychiatrists Association, which is relatively new in the UK. Quite excited about it. Yep. So that's me.
I saw you had been on it was a YouTube broadcast of a podcast. I don't remember the name of it offhand, but where you've been talking about some of those things and about the Black Psychiatrists organization in the UK.
Yes.
And the formation of that and what you do with that is very exciting to see that going on over there.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
I talked to a few people in the human service and mental health field in the UK, but it's a system that's so different to work within. So I'm always very interested to talk to, our colleagues across the pond. I can't even get through it. I start to say it and I'm like, they're going to be like, oh geez, here we go. American
cheesy is good.
Thinks, yeah, exactly. But, that's the kindred spirit real part. When you reached out to me about this, we were talking about, the show, as anybody who's really ever listened to this show before knows, I am, of course, a big fan of culture. We do a lot of breakdown, sort of like psychoanalysis or psychological breakdown of movies and of different parts of culture. And so what do you think it is that draws you into that? Is it just a way to break it down, or do you feel like those things are representative of what people are going through? What are some of your thoughts?
I think it's a number of things. So when we think about popular culture, whether we're talking about TV shows, whether we're talking about music, whether we're talking about TikTok, we have a lot of these TikTok influencers peddling all kinds of things, And for me, when I talk to my patients, if you're not careful, and I'm sure, Dwight, you can see this, is there tends to be a hierarchy. We know about psychiatry. We know about the that advantage position that you have as a psychiatrist. But what you have in common with your patients is you might be watching the same TV shows or not. You might be listening to the same music or not. And there's nothing like being able to discuss these TV shows. And also, we know that with popular culture, a lot of the perception of mental health might be related to what's on TV show and films. and popular culture as well. So if we don't tap into it, I think we miss a trick in terms of discussing their mental health, their treatment, stigma, and moreover, especially when it comes to things like certain minoritized communities, you understand, who might not necessarily be able to engage with mental health treatments due to years of, structural racism and that. Sometimes TV shows and movies can be a way in, and I have certainly seen it. And moreover, I'm also big on teaching. And I don't know what it's like in the States, but certainly in the UK, psychiatry is lower down the chain in terms of when in UK, you would say like resident doctors don't necessarily want to go into psychiatry. But when you start discussing TV show or movies, they're like, well, this is interesting. I can have my interest and still have a career in medicine. So for me, popular culture is really big on that, really.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel exactly the same way when you say that. There's this kind of two sides where popular culture gets us. It's something that we can all relate to, as you put it really, really well, with the teaching aspect of that, of saying, well, here's this concept, do you ever see, and anybody who's ever worked with me as a client knows they're going to hear some Simpsons quotes here and there, or they're going to hear some, it's like, oh, hey, getting into that. And then on the other hand, too, I had heard a perspective a long time ago where someone said that the movies and the television that you see, they compared it to kind of like the dreams of society. In other words, there does seem to be some common themes that do pop up at times where we all kind of either we want or need or are experiencing, and obviously there's all these stories being told of a way that we process. The stories that we tell are the way we process through trauma or a shared experience or our fears or even our hopes, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I see how it gets us on both sides. Like we can use it to relate to each other. And then also it is, I believe, a manifestation of where people are at as a culture. As not every person watches everything or listens to every song, but on average, there's something that unites us about the types of stories we tell, I think.
Definitely. And, just to go on, like, if you don't mind me, Dwight, I can give a few examples.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's see over here.
Please, Dwight, remind me, we've got to talk about The Sopranos and Beef. I've got to throw in Beef, that new Netflix TV show. But like for me, my favorite TV show, and in my opinion, okay, Dwight, just telling you, the best TV show, I think, is The Wire. I think it's a fantastic show. Based in Baltimore, HBO does amazing shows. To have both The Wire and The Sopranos. But I think about The Wire. On the surface, when you look at it, you look at the seasons, groundbreaking show. And I think what's so amazing about it is it's based in Baltimore and it covers a number of themes. It talks about labor unions. It talks about gangs. It talks about social determinants of health, poor housing, poor education, journalism, crime, drugs. Now, on the surface, when you tell people about it, and especially when you talk about recent generations, Dwight, they're like they're fast-paced shows. So I speak to my daughter. She's 15 years old. She's recently watching Breaking Bad, and to her, she's really excited about it. But when you look at a movie like the TV show like The Wire, you've got to follow it up. But what is The Wire about? It's based in Baltimore. And Baltimore is a city which is affected by redlining. We think about what redlining is. When we go to the history and the perspective of redlining, especially in Baltimore, you're looking at 1936. But in general, in redlining, we think about the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933. And at that particular time, it was just a method of structural racism where poor Black and Hispanic areas were basically parcellated and redlined and seen as areas of poor investment areas. So what did that mean? That meant there was a process called planned shrinkage, whereby investment was taken out, and so there became a criminal world within it. Shops weren't there, poor housing, poor schools, you understand, crime, and it meant your income went down, poverty. Now, when we look at those are social determinants of mental health because the risk of mental health increases. And we think about generations and generations of that. By the time you add Jim Crow, you have this process called syndemic. So a syndemic is where you have a number of disadvantages coming together to have a synergistic effect. So you could be poor, you understand. Then if your father is incarcerated, we'll come to the war on drugs, but you understand. And you understand. And then you're having poor housing, water. That could increase rather than just an additive effect, you have a synergistic combination. And therefore, when you're looking at how to solve the problem, you need to look at how they come together. But The Wire really shows this, and I think that is really, really fantastic. Now, a similar TV show in the UK is called Top Boy. So in Top Boy, it's based in an area very, very similar. So although there wasn't the process of redlining, but when Caribbean folk came to the UK, initially they were not allowed, access to housing. But because of the nature of racism and poverty, they stay in these, a number of people stay in like high-rise buildings, no access to green space. When we look at green space, access to green space, something like that, if you have access to green space,
food deserts or other areas like that, where
absolutely.
I grew up in a city area where it was like if you went to a full blown grocery store, you had to get in a car, right? But there were a bunch of places you could walk to, but it was like you got your bread and milk and your cereal and Pop-Tarts kind of thing. But yeah, your big produce section. We were lucky in the city I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We had a farmer's market in the center of the town that had fresh veggies and things that people could get to. That was like an old school thing, but not all areas have that. Particularly, those you mentioned. So that's fascinating. So some of the experiences there. I'm of course familiar with redlining. I say, of course. I shouldn't say, of course. They don't do a great job of teaching it in school, but especially, but learning about that later about redlining here, and you're talking about the similar effects in the UK, of which I don't. I don't have a lot of that knowledge. We're even worse. Even worse in teaching our own racist history is we don't learn much about other histories here in America. I'm taking shots at the American educational system, so we'll see. Tweet at me, not you, for that one.
Yes. So Top Boy really does highlight this kind of thing. So they a bit, focus on echoes. And also when you look at, massive incarceration, and let's talk about how the TV show like this talks about the war on drugs. So when we look at the war on drugs, we have to go to 1986 when they had the Anti-Drug, Abuse Act. And in 1986, what did that show? Very interesting things. So we see that if you had 1 gram of crack cocaine, you got the same prosecution and punishment as someone having 100 grams of powdered cocaine. Now, what does that show you? We know that white folks are more likely to have powdered cocaine, black folks with crack cocaine. Now, what does that mean? That means there was massive incarceration of black folk, you understand? It was criminalized, really. And what that meant is there was massive incarceration. And when we're talking about risk factors, we increase that risk of having mental health problems, and again, those social determinants of mental health. When you look at Top Boy, you also see that because we know black folk in the UK are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched. In the UK, they are, in spite of using less drugs, or at least similar drugs, they're more like 8 to 9 times more likely to be prosecuted for drug offenses or jailed for drug offenses. So when we see things like that, and we look at the risk of it, the whole stereotype of the crack fiend, and you see, crack baby mothers. And even in some of those TV shows, black people, unfortunately, ended up taking some of those stereotypes. But when we look at what happened with the opiate epidemic, we saw that was seen differently. Because when that happened, it was now seen as public health. We didn't have the same criminalization. And so these kind of shows basically look at that. Now, one thing that I find very, very interesting is when you look at some of the characters. So there's a character in The Wire called Bubbles. Bubbles is this chap who basically has an opiate use disorder. But what's very, very interesting, he breaks the mold. He's smart, you see him going through the journey. Now, you and I, Dwight, know that Prochaska and D. Clement have this cycle of change, that when you want to go for a cycle of change for the better, You go through a pre-contemplation stage, a contemplation stage, an action stage, and a maintenance stage. The great thing about this TV show is you see Bubbles going through it. And because of the kind of show The Wire is, it takes 5 seasons. He just doesn't go, you see his trials and tribulations. And you've been a psychotherapist, right? You actually see how he uses humor. He doesn't want to address his problems, really. And eventually, we see him go to connect to Narcotic Anonymous, where he stands up and he basically, bears his heart. And it's just a beautiful thing to see him get better. But it basically shows that cycle of addiction. It shows you the recovery model. It shows you can get better. And it doesn't overtly medicalize it. So this is something which I am working with a resident doctor in the States. We've actually got a model in popular culture in a Texas medical school. And we use it as a model to teach on social determinants of health. And there's another thing. Sorry, Dwight. When I get into my bag, I'm just going to go
doing
on
great.
and on and on. Yes. But there is a character there called D'Angelo. Now, let's think about this, Dwight. We talk about moral injury. What's moral injury? Moral injury, we often relate that to soldiers. They go to Iraq, they commit moral transgressions, they feel very, very guilty about it. But we accord that to soldiers, to health workers during COVID, where they didn't have enough PPE, they felt they had failed, they became very, very upset.
So friends even get sick and die as they were right and
Absolutely.
had the risk of death, sure, yeah.
Absolutely. But what are people in our urban areas? What about people in this urban area? So there's this character, D'Angelo. You're in a situation where his dad was selling drugs. He's in a criminal stuff. But then there's a situation where a civilian gets shot. Now, he has to sell drugs to people in his community. Is it possible that these people are also at risk of developing moral injury? It's something we don't look at because society looks down at these folk. But the same thing happens, and we see him become depressed and basically self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. And I think it's very fascinating that a show like The Wire begins to explore these kind of things. And the other thing, like I said, is also looking at the intersection. So there's this beautiful scene in The Wire where we see this guy, Wallace. We see the state of his home. We see the poor education. And we see him later become depressed. It's very, very subtle. And the mental health angle isn't shoved in your face. But you do see it come through powerfully in a TV show.
It's very interesting to see some of those depictions in fact, it was funny, just, I won't even remember which one. I did a couple of recordings of episodes for the podcast recently. And so one of them, listeners will hopefully know which one because they will have heard it. But we mentioned the stages of change. And the fact is, we often are we assume the only ones that we're really aware of most of the time is we think of basically using and not using, right? It's this all or nothing thinking that we do. And unfortunately, even as clinicians, we fall into that trap. Someone walks into the office, we assume they're at the action stage. And it's just because I got a DUI last week does not mean I'm at the action stage, right? And so you see the way it's depicted in something like this, I really like that, where it's like taking the time to draw that out and say, this is something that people have to go through. That people have to move from stage to stage. They don't jump right to the get clean step, right? Because because maybe people want them to or whatever. And when you look at those those predeterminants programmed into society, man, that is a very powerful type of thing. Because once you people may not realize, and those of us who have worked with people in the criminal justice system, once you get in, it's hard to get out. Now,
absolutely,
and definitely harder for some. People may not realize that if you walk into a courtroom with a criminal charge and you have a privately paid attorney who walks in standing next to you, and I will say I've known people who had a family friend who wasn't even a criminal justice attorney, who just showed up with them out of a favor. And as soon as the prosecutor realized that, there's a lawyer here with you. Well, anyway, we'll make this offer. All of a sudden, a nicer offer comes. They weren't even hiring the guy. It's just, hey, my, stepfather, father-in-law, neighbor, friend's friend, whatever, comes in with me and just says, oh yeah, I'm just here with them, not representing them. Great. How about we change that to a class B misdemeanor?
Yeah.
And it's like, why did you didn't offer that to the last guy who just came in by himself? And so then there's that access to wealth, access to money. And then of course the integrated racism into that. And I think that fiction is so powerful because it can put you into that, right? It can put you into that place when you're watching and you invest and you're like, I care about this character and they have a life that I have never had and probably will never have, particularly for someone like me growing up and being like, and it's been funny, the things I've been introduced to and then gone and studied as a white guy to go, oh my gosh, really? I thought I was pretty aware. And then I go look up something and it's like, wow, that's totally the way it is, So it's really an interesting way to get people thinking and identifying and having empathy and understanding for each other as people.
Yeah. And there's another TV show, Euphoria. So thinking broadly, okay. So Euphoria is a very interesting TV show. It's a coming of age, TV show. And it's got Zendaya. Zendaya's character is basically called Rue. Now, what's very, very interesting, we see Zendaya develop an addiction to opiates. So, we see a situation where her dad has cancer. Sorry, spoilers, you understand. She starts using his painkillers. Then that progresses to heroin. But there's one scene that I love. This particular scene, now some people have condemned it that it's too graphic about the depiction of drug use. But there's this particular scene where she goes to her drug dealer. I believe his name is Fez. She goes there, and while she's there, his connect is basically has fentanyl on him. Now, Fez does not want to touch that stuff. You understand? So I introduced the concept of the ethical drug dealer. So let me just break it down before people say, what? An ethical drug dealer? So the Connect wants to give Rue, Zendaya's character, the fentanyl. Obviously, Fez knows the impact it will have on her. And the fentanyl addiction, particularly in the States, how it's devastating communities. And it's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine and all that.
We've had record deaths the last year. Right?
Absolutely, record deaths. And especially now, even we know that they now have over-the-counter, Narcan, intranasal. The Biden government has pushed that forward. And we know now that it's mixed with xylazine. Sorry, I do go off on this tangent, do I understand? But back to the story. Back to the story. So what's interesting, this guy gives her the fentanyl, and she goes into respiratory depression. What's really, really interesting, her drug dealer Fez actually has his Narcan kit and gives her naloxone and basically reverses the respiratory depression, which otherwise would kill her. Now, one of the things we had in the UK, I don't know if you had it in the States, was when COVID happened, people stopped getting drugs from their regular drug dealers. And now that we're talking about harm minimization, I sometimes ask them, what relationship do you have with your drug dealer? Does your drug dealer have your back? You understand? Obviously, Fez had his, the person he was selling drugs to back because he ensured she didn't take fentanyl. He refused to. So even they say honor among thieves, but even there's a moral code among them. And so when people's usual drug supply was disrupted, it's sometimes a way in. Do you trust your supplier? How long has it been supplied? If he or she, if there was a bad drug batchment, would they let you know about it? And especially we're big on harm minimization. We know, I can give you an example. Like, for example, in San Francisco, we've had deaths. So they closed some of the supervised drug consumption centers. So these were opportunities where people could come, use drugs under supervision. If they went to respiratory depression, reverse it. Someone got the drug dealers. And when you look at the homelessness in San Francisco, so in the first quarter of the year, I believe there've been an increase in deaths by about 41%. We call those deaths of despair. You understand? Since they've closed these supervised consumption rooms. And it's just a pity, you understand that these things are happening. In the UK, particularly in Scotland, Scotland has one of the highest drug deaths in Europe. And obviously the UK, yes, they do. They do. So they want to introduce things like supervision, consumption rooms, but it's not yet legal in the UK. So these are the kind of discussions that you can have with TV shows like Euphoria. Now, taking you back to The Wire, there's a scene where one of the guys is injecting heroin and is doing this process called slamming. So slamming is where they inject heroin. And Bubbles tells him, slow down, because Bubbles realizes that when you slam too quickly, you have a high plasma concentration of the dose and there's an increase of respiratory depression. So Bubbles basically tells him to slow it down. So you have these kind of like messaging, in terms of the TV shows, which will be very, very difficult, So these are some of the things that, like, in the talks we do to medical students, or when you're discussing public, with the public, you can introduce it, and maybe there's a more sympathetic, face to it, really. So I just think it's just fantastic.
Yeah, to have it in, because as we know, one of the things that contributes to overdose deaths and to addiction in general is, addiction over the years became considered to be a public behavior and eventually law enforcement problem, because doctors didn't know how to register it originally, right? Yeah. And it was taken over. But so essentially, you have something that's always been labeled a morality problem, a behavioral problem. You're a bad person, kind of thing. And so, one of the things that telling these kinds of stories can do is it can help people to have. There's a face. All of a sudden, I remember that character, and wow, that was complicated in that story, and to say, well, there could be someone who's a drug dealer and also trying to be a good person at the same time. That seems like, really, and it's, well, of course, if you really thought about it, you'd think, well, every group of people is representative of every subgroup of people, and there's nicer people and worse people in any random handful of people. So of course you're going to have one drug dealer who's going to be more ethical and maybe have more empathy or more kindness than another one or something. And absolutely, and then trying to, and the other idea there is the idea of need, that I've heard it put, the addiction is often the illusion of need, right? Of I have to, and then you throw on the actual chemical dependence that I have to. I mean, with opiates, if I don't. And we saw this during the pandemic when people couldn't get access, for in some cases alcoholism, in some cases opiate dependence. People were dying because of lack of ability to get their drug of choice. Absolutely. And so it was a problem people didn't want to talk about still, in a way that was like, how do we solve this? And so anyway, you throw that in there, and it's like, but so sometimes the storytelling does give us a way to do it. One of the things I remember about The Wire, as you're talking about it, I think ties in here is, and to me it seemed courageous in a way, but the season finale at the very end, they really put emphasis on showing a bunch of the neighborhoods and a bunch of the problems. And it was interesting because some people didn't like it because the ending of the series just indicated that, this problem is ongoing. It wasn't like a nice wrap up. It was uncomfortable and jarring for people, which I thought was kind of a bold choice, because the nature of the problem is, let's not pretend it's not, we all have the privilege in our bedroom to sit here and push stop, and I'm out of that world, right? And it's like, no, but it exists. It's still there, is the message.
Dwight, which brings me on to the next show. You see, Dwight, I just feel as if, we're going back and forth. But each time you say things, so talking about things that doesn't have a nice, ending, which is really interesting. So there's this show called I May Destroy You. I don't know if you've watched it. It's by Michaela Coel. I believe HBO were involved. So she's this amazing UK lady. So again, it's basically about this UK lady that is a writer who basically gets her drink spiked and is sexually assaulted. But it's really interesting because it's a messy story. This is a lady that she takes drugs from time to time. She doesn't have a dependence. She's loud. And throughout the TV show, even though she's sexually assaulted, it doesn't portray her as a victim. So it is really, really messy. But to go a long story short of it, it does address issues like racism and, class and things like that. But what I find very, very interesting is there's a particular scene where she sees a therapist, you understand? But for me, it just brings up issue of how Black women are seen in therapy. Because sometimes in therapy, we talk about cultural humility. And sometimes in therapy, Black women, and I'm just thinking that a woman like her will be seen as a Jezebelic character, over-sexualized, loud Black woman. That's the way they will see her. And sometimes when Black women go for therapy, they're tone police. You can't be angry. You can't. But when you think about years of structural racism, when you think about intersectionality, how much is that basically addressed in therapy? But this TV show is really, really good. It talks about the relationship with her dad, the relationship with her mother. It's really, really dense with all kinds of things. And, we have amazing TV shows. So talking about psychotherapy, in treatment, I always recommend that's a great show that highlights psychotherapy. But in season 4, you have a Black psychotherapist around the time of the pandemic. And it's really powerful to see a Black psychotherapist who isn't a mommy character, a character that is just there to be there for the white folk. But it sees the interplay about how you can see racism in psychotherapy. So there's one scene where she sees this white patient who is being racist, who actually sits in her seat. So you see these power dynamics and basically how she handles it. So it's a really, really good show. And I just think these shows are amazing because obviously it changes the notion that Black folk can't receive therapy. And we also see what powerful things can happen when you have a Black therapist that understands the needs of their Black patients. So I think that's really, really powerful,
Yeah. And the safety and access, there's elements of access to care that have nothing to do with money, although money is a big part of it, especially over here. I know you guys have a different system, right? Josh Wood comes on my show sometimes he has a business manager for a nonprofit in Nottingham, where they work with that quite a bit. In that we've talked some of the differences of the American and the UK system, and it's fascinating how that is. But one of the big access to care, and the one we really talk about all the time over here is insurance and money. And it's like, okay, but what about the ability to get there? What about what neighborhood is the office there, right? And do I feel safe going here or there, and those types of things. And the fact that we don't talk about them, I think, denotes a little bit of privilege, right? Of who's having the discussion. Is there just are we even aware? And I think a lot of therapists, when we talk about things like cultural awareness, I'm going to throw it out there. I'll be interested. People can react however they want to this. I'd love to hear people's feedback, but I feel like therapy, by and large, you can't paint with too broad a brush, I guess, but the industry of therapy is largely staffed with people who are, let's put it, well-intentioned white liberals. I'm going to throw that in there.
Oh, definitely.
Because, who are like, oh, we're really good and we're really woke and we're really aware. And it's like sometimes people like me who are over here trying to be helpful and thinking like, oh, I'm really aware, I'm really progressive, I'm really this. We need to shut up and listen sometimes to say, who am I really trying to help? And am I even aware of how I'm positioning myself? Where do I'm in private practice. Where did I put my office? Where do I advertise? What kinds of things do I work out with people as far as, cultural availability that I have? Do I listen to people of a different culture come to my office and let them educate me about their experience and believe them when they tell me? Do you know what I mean?
So that is cultural humility. But I would even say it's deeper than that. So I've got a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And I'll be honest, I put pressure. Come from Nigeria. I tell them, you're going to have to work 5 times harder than the white people in your class. It puts pressure on them. But it brings you to this concept of cultural humility, being able to step back, appreciate race, your role in the perpetuation of race and how it influences your practice or your culture. But there's one, movie, Black Panther. On the surface, you're like, what has Black Panther got to teach us? But for me, my experiences as a Black man are different from my children's experiences. I grew up in Nigeria. In Nigeria, it was full of Black people. From my vice chancellor, the tenured professors down to the cleaner, they were all Black folk. So I've only known Black role models. Obviously, I came to the UK. So my experience here is different. I see myself as African. My children, on the other hand, grew up in the UK. In terms of models, yes, they've got their parents, but when they look at the TV and around them, it seems to be white folk doing amazing things. But this is really interesting because look at the perspective of T'Challa and Killmonger. So T'Challa is from this amazing, this amazing, kingdom of Wakanda. Killmonger, on the other hand, grew up on the hood, has affiliations with Black Panther. So T'Challa is like, look, let's maintain the status quo, what we've got here. But Killmonger is like, man, you're getting too comfortable in Wakanda. Our brothers, are Black folk throughout the area. They're suffering, they're not really experiencing good things. And even among Black folk, there's a sophistication, are you African American? Are you African? And I think as a Black person, I need to learn from the experience of second generation Afro-Caribbeans, you understand? Or basically second generation as an African. And we can learn from each other, really.
Yeah. Oh, it's very fascinating in that story as well, how the villain's plan ends up being carried out in a much different way by the hero at the end. That's one of the things that's very fascinating to me about Black Panther. And I think it also goes along with whenever you have a good villain, an effective villain in those kinds of movies is one who isn't completely wrong. Now, you know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Like Killmonger's not wrong. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
He's just going to go. It's just that, T'Challa isn't cool with like, well, let's not go kill everybody. Let's not do it through violence, essentially. Not the same way as how Killmonger wants to approach it, but he ends up enacting some things that were the basis of Killmonger's plan, right? I mean, that's a very interesting thing. You can see even in that beginning scene in the museum, when he's like, hey, I want to buy it. And they're like, well, it's not for sale. And he's like, well, y'all stole it. So
Absolutely.
And it's right. But even that's actually a true principle. Right.
Yeah. But even talking about the so-called anti-hero, I said I was going to come back to The Sopranos. I mean, Sopranos, groundbreaking at its time. We think about the origins of The Sopranos. 1999, we had analyzed this. And I felt analyzed this with all due respect to Billy Crystal and Robert De Niro. To be honest, the way it portrayed psychotherapists, there was a lot of stereotypes. But when we think about Sopranos in 1999, it was groundbreaking because you have these tough members of the Italian mob. And I say with all due respect, because I know some Italian Americans feel that it's stereotypes, but just to go along with the theme. But we see how Dr. Melfi, in terms of psychiatry, we talk about a biopsychosocial approach. So we see about the origin of Tony Soprano's panic attacks. We see the scene where he sees the dogs, the fly away, and how his therapist, Dr. Melfi, enables him to see that as symbolic of him being worried that his family are going to leave him. We see when he has his first panic attack. So she takes a childhood history, which we know in psychotherapy is important, but a good psychiatrist will take an early history. And his first panic attack is when he realizes his dad gets sausages from someone that his dad had beaten up. We also see a situation. There's one powerful scene where Tony Soprano's mom is mean. She basically tries to get him killed. But there's a situation where Tony Soprano has, you can call it whether it's an illusion or a dissociative episode or hallucinations. She doesn't rush to treat him with the drugs, but she soon finds in that scene, he sees an Italian student. Now, Tony Soprano is popular with women and likes to have sex with lots of women. But this lady is very platonic. And then there's a scene where this Italian dentist student is actually breastfeeding him. And then when he finds, Dr. Melfi asks him who the baby is, it's actually Tony. And she interprets it that is basically the mother that he wants to have, the nurturing mother who's breastfeeding him, who's giving him unconditional love. And I think it's a very powerful way, because when I work with like the resident doctors, I always tell them about, don't just jump. Okay, yes, someone has a hallucination, they're psychotic, but try and understand what the hallucinations mean, what it represents. And I do think working within biopsychosocial, you can treat, but trying to understand, are these hallucinations, are they functional? What do the delusions represent? So there are all kinds of interesting discussions that you can have. And I think for a movie for a TV show in its time, Sopranos was groundbreaking. There will be no in-treatment or all these tons of movies with psychotherapists without the Sopranos.
It's a really good point. And you could, people could debate whether or not this was something the show orchestrated or just the fans and the viewing public forgot about. But I feel like people don't talk about the groundbreaking element of that show was not only that it was like, here's the private lives of mobsters, and we're going to really get into their personalities. It was actually more what you just mentioned, the application of like a psychoanalytical perspective and a psychological perspective. And that was a really groundbreaking thing. And it's interesting, as you put it, even in that scene and that plot line there would go to say, oh, well, why is this guy, we can look and say, boy, he's doing all these behaviors. He treats women the way he does and all this kind of stuff. He's just a big dirtbag. Which, I mean, it'd be hard to argue that Tony Soprano isn't a dirtbag, but the reason for his dirtbaggery, right? We're talking about that separation and that he's chasing after something. And I think a lot of toxic masculine behaviors really fall into
and the woman he dates.
Chasing. Yeah.
Dwight, what's interesting is Dr. Melfi points out that his wife, Camilla, she's in UK, she's all right, you understand? But a lot of the women he dates are very similar to his mother. And Tony always flies off the handle like, you're coming off with this Freudian stuff. But she says, isn't it interesting that you're going after women who are very similar to your mother? You understand, in terms of being very toxic. He continuously repeats patterns. And there's something in psychotherapy about how we can repeat patterns. People who have been abused, get over and over again into abusive patterns. We also have the opportunity to see I think they call it Marlon's triangle, where there's a dad between a relationship in the past and how that is brought into the present. So really, really interesting things to have a discussion with the public about how psychotherapy works, but also with, trainee psychotherapists or, psychiatrists, to make them more psychologically minded as well.
And it's interesting because one of the things also people sometimes look at it like, what's that whole mentality of like, if you think this one main character is really cool, you probably missed the point. And if it's like, well, Tony Soprano, really interesting. But when people are like, oh yeah, he's awesome, it's like, no, he's not really awesome. But but the interesting thing too about that is a tragic nature of the storyline is that ultimately, he does not reject those patterns. He ultimately continues to do them. Some people have even interpreted the season finale, which, speaking of season finales that pissed people off, why is it, maybe the more thoughtful ones actually annoy people, but some people have interpreted that to say, it just is, he's just at dinner, there's music, and it just cuts out, and it's like, well, kind of the message is there that left to his own devices, he's just going to keep doing the same stuff that he's always done. Now, I know there's a debate people have over whether or not he gets killed 10 seconds after it fades to black. Spoiler alert, by the way, for the ending of The Sopranos. This is all basically, we're just talking about the whole thing. This came out a million years ago. But so I don't know if he got secretly killed by the Russians right after that or whatever. But the fact is that he's still continuing the same dysfunctional patterns by the end of the show.
No, absolutely.
Tragic, but also not unrealistic, especially for a guy like that who's so much of his identity, and we could say even his career, is wrapped up into being that guy, being that toxic male, right?
Yes.
So he can't change in the way that he's living. And it's an interesting thing that shows that entrenchment. I think that seeing people make sometimes really self-destructive choices. Well, I mean, it's more, sometimes it's more entertaining to watch people make the self-destructive choice. Of course, that shows up. But I think it can build an understanding and a bridge where many of us, let's be honest, most of it's not as dramatic as what Tony Soprano does on his bad days. However, we do tend to get caught in the same patterns. And we see it in therapy. People come in and they're like, boy, I got to change. I can't believe that I've been doing this one problem for 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever years it's been.
Absolutely.
And like to try to look at that and say, yeah, actually, we kind of understand that people get caught into patterns. It's hard to change a pattern.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And talking about that, again, I've got to throw Beef. So,
yeah, and I
there's
haven't
this
seen
new
Beef
TV
yet.
show
So yeah,
Netflix.
let's
Beef
throw that
is
out.
fantastic. You've got Ali Wong. So it's basically a story. And what I like about it, the cast is, Asian Americans, which is good. They're the leads. So it's always good when, representation matters. But obviously you have this, in LA, you have this posh woman, Ali Wong's character, and I believe it's Stephen Young's character, and they basically have a go, and it basically spirals out of control. So they basically have beef and it spirals out of control. But what's very interesting is you look at it, both of them are depressed. Both of them suppress their emotions a lot. And both of them are extremely angry. You know how Freud spoke about how depression is anger turned inwards? You understand? So a lot of them suppress their emotions. And so there's a lot of self-hatred. You see that in them. But occasionally, for whatever reason, it spills out with each other. You understand? Yeah. And what's very, very interesting, you see evidence of depression. So you know how they say the functioning depressed person? Both of them, you get snippets of that there. And again, spoiler alert, because at the beginning of the show, one of the characters actually tries to take his life. You understand? So that's quite interesting. But there's one thing there, again, where they're constantly advising him to go for therapy. And I think it's Stephen Young's character says stuff like, Western therapy doesn't work on Asian minds. I think it's so powerful because it's something, again, what we've been speaking about, it's really powerful. So I think that's a really good show. It's very subtle, the depression, but that's something that really, because when I watch these shows, I enjoy it. But then I'm like, wow, when you've watched so many shows, now I'm just seeing, maybe I'm just looking too much, but you see some of those. And even like, let me show you how weird it gets. Sesame Street. When I grew up in Nigeria, I love Sesame Street. So I'm talking about Big Bird, Grover. I'm not talking about Elmo. Elmo was way before my time. I'm talking about I'm talking about 79.
Yeah, Elmo was coming out when my youngest sibling was. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was with
absolutely.
You. Yeah.
Yes, but they actually have a character, Julia, who has autistic spectrum disorder. Mm-hmm. So imagine having TV shows, children's shows. It's really, some of them are really powerful. You understand that at highlighting some of these things.
My brother-in-law just mentioned the other day that that he had seen the new. I haven't watched the new Peter Pan on Disney Plus yet. I guess there's another one of those, but there is, and he just mentioned that there was more disability representation, and there was I guess a character with Down syndrome that was there. That's so important for people to see themselves.
Yes, but also, like I said, I think the teaching, I just think is so good. Also, we also have TV shows. If we're being honest, Dwight, have not really made it up to the mark. I've got to say this, 13 Reasons Why comes to mind. So I don't know if you've heard of 13 Reasons.
I have. People kept trying to get me to watch it when it was on, and I never got around to it. And then I read a bunch of critiques about. I'm interested to see what you're going to say about how it represented mental health. That wasn't
I'll keep
so
it
good.
short.
Sweet. Do it.
Okay. So
because I haven't done that much on here because of my own dearth of knowledge. Go ahead.
13 Reasons Why. People will say, well, TV show, it talks about suicide and, but the thing I have with the show is, one, it is graphic in the sexual assault, so could potentially be very triggering. Secondly, it is very graphic with the suicide attempt. And we know there's the risk of the contagion effect. So basically what that means to the audience, if you don't know, is that when people see things on popular media and it's very graphic, there's the risk that people could adopt those suicide. Now, what's interesting is I actually discussed with a patient of mine. She said she watched it and she found it helpful. And she found it helpful because she said she realized she wasn't alone. And some people said they were asking for help, checking, anti-suicide lines. So almost the same impact that you had like with Logic, Logic's song where he had the suicide line. There was an increase in people calling suicide lines after he did that rap song with, I believe it was Alicia Cara. I think that's her name. But at the same time, with 13 Reasons Why, after it, there was an increase. And there's research to show that there was actually an increase in people going to pro-suicide websites, really. Wow. So again, it's really important. And I'm going to have to bring this one up. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm a psychiatrist. Now, I'm going to have to say this, Dwight, but ECT does work on the right patients.
Oh, that's absolutely. Okay. That's absolutely yes. That one. And I had a professor who actually used to quote, he'd mentioned that one and A Clockwork Orange, which is much, let me say watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is much more enjoyable than watching The Clockwork Orange. However, just as far as that goes, but no, both of them turned people off to ECT and CBT.
No, it did, because it saw it as punitive, didn't it? Yeah. And when I speak to the older generation, what you find out is you need to spend a lot more time discussing ECT. It's changed, and a lot of the time you have to address One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You have to address it, or else,
No, it's and I read the novel and I've seen the movie and it's actually I also enjoyed it. However, I will say, along with you, as a mental health professional, especially the people that I hear who have concerns, and we have lots of differing treatments. A lot of people try ketamine, a little bit safer side effects, but ECT nowadays is very, very different than it was. And the fact that when you're watching the movie, one of the issues is that you don't sit there and think, oh, I'm watching someone take a legitimate medical treatment and abuse other people with it. No, what you think is, wow, man, society coming down and frying your brain just for being different, man, which is kind of the message you're being sent. And so, unfortunately, it does limit people's willingness to engage. You know what? I think about this whenever this comes up, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for all of its strengths, it is one of the earlier versions of this story of, hey, you know what? We're going to cure mental illness by just being cool. We're just
absolutely,
hey, man,
absolutely.
Don't be so uptight.
Absolutely.
And I always think of my favorite episode of the show House. So my favorite episode of my favorite episode, as I said, my favorite episode of the show House was a season premiere they had where Dr. House, played by Hugh Laurie, of course, goes into a psychological rehab, has a breakdown at the end of one season. And of course, he's a drug addict. That's a big part of he has opiate dependence that he's hiding and things. So he actually gets clean and goes to a mental institution for a stay. And the interesting thing is, it's this 2-hour one, and you could watch it just as its own movie. If all you knew was, hey, this is a short TV movie about an asshole doctor who goes in to get some mental health treatment. It's all you need to know. It has none of the other characters in it. And the interesting thing is that he, at one point, sneaks out of the grounds with this other guy, and they go to this county fair, and they're just kind of hanging out. And it's so smacks of that, oh, yeah, we're just kind of being groovy and just to be easy on yourself. But at the end of this outing, before they go back to the hospital, the guy says, thanks. So they're in some parking garage. If I remember correctly, it's somewhere, they're up on a high area. And the guy says, thanks so much. This was so great. I just needed this. And then tries to kill himself by jumping. And so it shows, and the message at that point is, hey, you thought, and the psychiatrist on the unit is like, I know you're some brilliant doctor, but you thought you could just treat this guy like everything's cool. And guess what? Everything's not cool. And he needs medical help. And you're, and I've never seen that worked in before, when there's that trope of, hey, let's all just be cool. And it's like, yeah, someone can die if you don't address their medical needs.
Absolutely.
So, it is interesting how these things send alternate messages, and maybe we're updating a little bit to have some better messages. Yes. I hope.
So what do you think of the Joker with, I think, was it Joaquin Phoenix? Because the Joker was interesting. The Joker was just a whole mishmash of stereotypes. You had the hallucinations, you had the explosive laughter. So from that, you think about pseudobulbar affect, head injury. There are just so many things. Because I think the Joker character, there's actually, I can't remember who wrote it, but there's actually an article in the British Journal of Psychiatry Bulletin where this chap, actually the author, writes on the various editions of the Joker. You know, this whole thing where they talk about someone with schizophrenia, split personality, and and these kind of things have an impact on, stigma. So sometimes a TV show potentially can do damage. But even if they're not done, if a patient has watched it, you can basically have those kind of conversations. I'm working with a resident doctor of mine, and she recently did a talk at a local teaching. There's this TV show called Hollyoaks, and she's interested in perinatal conditions, perinatal psychosis, postpartum psychosis and postpartum depression. And she basically showed 2 TV clips from a Hollyoaks TV show, and used it to teach about how it was portrayed and what was done well and wasn't done so well. So we're basically using this to educate the next generation of, psychiatrists coming through, which is great.
It is. I know it is interesting how those things work in. And no, it is. It's something that I addressed. A couple of years. I don't know when this movie came out. This is several years ago now. But the movie Split. It was that M. Night Shyamalan movie that came out.
Yes.
As it turned out, it was in between Unbreakable and whatever the other one is. Glass. There we go. And,
yes.
And it was. We were talking. I talked about that with a client of mine who had multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and also some clinicians that had specialized in that. And so we did an episode with David Hart about that a few years back. And the interesting thing we came up with was, isn't it interesting that the multiple personality haver is the crazy murdering monster guy? Sort of. Spoiler for that movie. He's actually magic, not actually mentally ill, I guess. Anyway, whatever. Who knows? It was confusing. But so it makes this great story, but it's like, but why do we have like that character's a murderer, right? And at the time I remember we were talking about it to say, well, why don't, it would be one thing to say, here's a character who's a murderer. Don't we have any characters who are heroes? And guess what? The last couple of years, Moon Knight comes out. Now, Moon Knight already existed as a comic book character who's a superhero with dissociative identity disorder. And now it's a character in the MCU, a dissociative identity disordered individual who is a superhero. So, so that's kind of interesting too, to see some of that come back. But yeah, so just the playing around and we should do, this is, as always, this leads to an idea of another episode, but we ought to look at that sometime of the way that those stereotypes are played with, because I think you can see both healthy and less healthy things that come from it.
No, definitely.
Well, it's fascinating, and there's so much to it. I know we're going to have to talk more about some of this. I'm really grateful just to even start the conversation today.
No, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you, I like to ask guests who come on if they have any if they have any nonprofit or charities or just kind of community efforts that they believe in or are involved in. It doesn't have to be involved in the topics we're talking about, but it certainly can be. What would you recommend people get involved in out there to do some good?
Okay, so of recent, the issue in the UK, got to rep for the UK, is we have a situation where we've got a almost like, I won't say civil war in Sudan, but there's trouble in Sudan. So 2 generals are fighting in Sudan, and a number of people who are stuck in Sudan. Some of these are Sudanese doctors. Again, I've got to say this, but I think the UK government could be doing more. So there are appeals to get some of those UK doctors out. What is so sad, and I've got to bring this up, is when they had the war in Ukraine, guess what? The Ukrainians were treated better, offered housing. And what do we have with Sudanese? The darker skin. Go figure it out. So I would say support that. And obviously, in terms of the UK, there's also this thing about sending asylum seekers, mainly from Afghanistan and Syria, to Rwanda. Now, I'm African. I'm not knocking. But these are people who want to come here. They've got roots, family. we know about what social isolation does that. So just people speaking out about it and just basically mentioning it, really. So yeah, those are the causes which are there, to my heart in terms of the UK, really.
Yeah. So just the awareness and sharing things. People sometimes
awareness, yes,
and I think that's a really, I'd love to hear that, because sometimes we forget about the fact that yes, there's lots of organizations people can go, but sometimes if we're not in a position to have a lot of like funding, or we can't donate a bunch of money, we just kind of stop there and go, well, I would if I could. But what you're mentioning also, the interesting thing is we all have a sphere of influence,
yes,
online as well as in our own, and as people always say, like, what do I listen to? What do I retweet? What do I forward? What do I say that's not funny? What do I say that is,
absolutely,
this is intriguing or this is interesting? And so passing along, yeah, that's a great point.
We could all do better. I think, Dwight, what we're saying is we can all do better. We are all capable of off-the-cuff remarks, but we all need to do better, and educate ourselves.
And really purposefully using that. Thank you. How do people find you? Where should people come look for your work?
So for me, you can follow me on Twitter. So I keep it simple. I guess I need to build a website, but just go to me on Twitter. It's AK411 CAM. So AK41 at AK411 CAM.
AK411 CM.
CAM.
CAM. See, I messed it up.
CAM. So
CAM. Gotcha.
Canada, America, Mongolia. Sorry, that was just random.
I like that. That's a good call sign. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here today.
No, I really enjoyed it. I didn't know we would go through so many. Once I start talking about TV shows and movies, I just, I
know everyone around me understands exactly what you just said. Anyone in my general vicinity, because they're like, yeah, okay. Now we're on Moon Knight. How did that one happen?
I know. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.